The National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thank you, Mike. Today we're going to look at the most feared agency in the government, the Internal Revenue Service. And we'll try to decide if there's any hope of reform or if, as long as we have big government, we'll have big problems with its tax collectors.
Our program today will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and a very special analysis of the entire subject by Ron and his special guest, the noted economist Walter Williams. We'll begin our probe report, the IRS and the Taxpayers' Rights, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty because we agree with Thomas Jefferson that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
Of all the many agencies of the U.S. government, surely none has a poorer reputation among the people than the one whose headquarters is housed in this building, the Internal Revenue Service. Of course, a tax collection agency probably cannot ever hope to be popular. But the IRS problem is compounded by reports over the years of heavy-handed, repressive tactics that fly in the face of the Constitution and the people's expectations of ordinary human rights. It all started so innocently, in an innocent year, 1913. 1 month before Woodrow Wilson would take office with his progressive mandate, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution would be ratified, and the means to pay for all that progressivism would be at hand. At first, it was just a little bitty tax, and only the rich would pay at all. In fact, the other tariff revisions in the first income tax bill were considered much more significant. But several wars, new deals, and great societies later, how it has grown.
If you look at some of the people that opposed the amendment, they made predictions that at the time seemed nonsensical. And today, you can obviously see that much of what they said has come true.
As the tax rate grew and grew, so did the IRS, and so did troubling reports of abuses of IRS power.
Every hearing we had, you could bring in examples of the monstrous misuse of government authority that amounted to nothing more than intimidation because you had the taxpayer didn't know what their rights were and they were just scared to death.
I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American.
Many had hoped that Ronald Reagan, with his anti-IRS rhetoric and lower tax platform, would curb IRS abuses. But it didn't happen, and the big reason was the runaway federal deficit.
The budget deficits have not only put more pressure on the Congress, they put more pressure on the IRS, and it's giving much more in the way of resources to the IRS. Congress has been much more willing during the 1980s to give the IRS more money and more power.
We had members of the United States Congress, legislators, who were even leery or possibly afraid of retaliation by or from the IRS for passing legislation which would rein in their power, which would actually put into law the rights and the responsibilities of the taxpayer.
You think there were members of Congress who themselves were intimidated by the IRS?
No question in my mind.
If the IRS has the power to intimidate congressmen, aren't they even a greater threat to an ordinary citizen?
In certain instances, it certainly was true. If a prominent doctor in a small town was brought up on charges of income tax evasion, everybody in town knew about it. If a judge or other prominent citizen in a town was brought up, the word spread very rapidly. And let's face it, that does make people stop and think twice.
What the IRS does can have tragic personal consequences for families. A family that can't meet a mortgage payment or pay the grocery bills, or indeed a small business that goes under. Those are terrible human costs. And all too often, it seems the IRS doesn't take those costs into account.
One case, a 10-year-old child, her savings account with $694 in it was attached because her father owed $1,000 in back taxes. Well, we got that straight, but that should have never happened, and there were thousands of other stories like that.
An attorney who defended a newspaper in Miami going to jail for 3 or 4 months when he shouldn't have gone to jail for so much as a minute. A woman in North Carolina whose husband was forced to commit suicide because the IRS essentially drove him out of business even though they didn't know a dime. I mean, there are cases that are truly heart-rending about what the IRS has done to people.
My gosh, you've had people that have lost their lives in some cases. You've had a woman in Alaska that she decided she was going to challenge the IRS, and she sat down in a car they were trying to grab and pushed the plugs on the door so they couldn't open it. Gee, they went and got tire irons and bashed the windows in, dragged her through the glass. I mean, you know, they can be very rough. And it isn't just George Hansen saying this. This has been on 60 Minutes and some of the, you know, the big national publications.
Through his book and video productions, Hansen's foundation has exposed many cases of abuse. In one, the IRS sought back taxes from a Detroit area daycare center.
They violated their own arrangement, went into the center, captured it, so to speak, herded all the children into a room, set up a collection station at the entrance, and they basically gave the parents, when they came later in the day, the idea they couldn't take the child home till they sat down and wrote a check out to the daycare center so that the IRS could confiscate that check.
Is this kind of outrage just the result of some overzealous individual agents, or is the problem systemic?
It's systemic. And the reason for that is this special relationship that citizens have to the government when they're dealing with the IRS, that you have to prove that you are innocent rather than the government proving you're guilty.
Public clamor finally achieved a measure of success in 1988 when Congress passed legislation called the Taxpayers Bill of Rights. And in the final analysis, perhaps the problem is more fundamental than even the problem of IRS abuses.
I think it's clear the bigger the government is, the more they tax, the more power they have to use to enforce that tax. People don't naturally render money to the government. We don't have people making voluntary contributions to the federal government. So the larger the taxes, the higher the spending, the more power the government needs to get that money. And when you give lots of power to the tax collector, that's less liberty for the rest of us.
And so, for many, the problem remains. And as long as government is so big, with so many agencies and so much spending, the rights of the taxpayer surely will continue in a state of very precarious jeopardy.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
this is the best country in the world, we still should keep an eye on these things and try and stop the abuses, because if you don't, that's how people like Hitler and things like that come into being.
Each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a randomly selected group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching now is actual footage of the unrehearsed reactions of a group of people in Phoenix, Arizona to the probe report, The IRS and Taxpayers' Rights.
And it looks like to me it's going to have to come from the people because of the Congress and the deficit.
What is it that the IRS does best?
They love to confuse you. They'll send you paperwork, and you look at it and you go, what is that?
Do best? Oh, I'd say they were, if you really, they're persistent, they're tenacious, they'll do anything to get what they want.
They can take your salary, they can put you in jail, they can release you at their own discretion.
They are not gracious and friendly when you walk in there, or helpful. If they say you owe so much, you have to sit there and prove that you do not owe it to them. In other words, and sometimes it's like talking to that wall.
That lady who was thrown out of her car?
That was the one that comes to my mind.
She exhibited some backbone. The only thing is that one person can't fight the system and a group of men. That woman was powerless to defend herself. And had she tried to defend herself physically, she would have been beaten into oblivion.
What do you think of that Taxpayers' Bill of Rights? Is it a good thing, a bad thing? Is it enough, not enough?
I just don't think it's enough.
It's a good thing, but it's not enough.
It's a start. It's a start, but it's really not that much.
I am still not able to compete with the IRS on an equal footing.
But they could literally come in and take everything you own, close it all personal property. And I think this is important that people stop trying to be afraid. It's hard not to be afraid.
Yeah, the bigger the government, the more money, the more power.
I think the IRS is killing our country. I mean, literally killing us, because if we ever make a lot of money, all we want to do is tell nobody about it, hide it away, because we know if the IRS finds out, they're going to take it.
I would like to see the IRS abolished. I don't think that, I would like to see something else in its place.
Ruthless taxation has been the downfall of many countries.
What's going on now is what the first revolution was about. It's not impossible for another one to come up.
They don't mince words, do they? Well, let's hear what two real experts have to say about it. Our special guest today is Dr. Walter Williams, a nationally syndicated columnist and professor of economics at George Mason University. And our host and resident expert is the chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, there seems to be a lot of anger in those people.
Boy, I don't think there's any doubt about it. And from my experience traveling around the country, I have met a lot of angry people, a lot of people who are very upset. They're upset with the taxes they pay, they're upset with the Internal Revenue Service, they're upset with the tactics. And I'm just wondering whether, from your experience, Dr. Williams, whether you've come across this same situation.
I've come across the same thing, but it really gives a lot of meaning to what Benjamin Franklin said after he left the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He said, when the people find that they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the Republic. Now, what I mean by that is that, of course, there's a need for government. Of course, there's a need for taxes. But government should be doing those kind of things that are legitimate functions of government, namely protecting you and I from international thugs taking our property, from domestic thugs taking our property, and maybe it should be involved with the adjudication of disputes. But government has gone beyond its legitimate functions. It has engaged in immoral behavior, namely 2/3 of our budget represents acts where the government confiscates the property of one American and gives it to another American to whom it does not belong. And this is why we can't but avoid such a horrendous tax system that we have now.
You know, Frank Chatteroff wrote that we've had two revolutions in this country. One, our original revolution, which was opposed to high taxation. And he said the other revolution literally occurred in 1913 with the institution of the income tax. Do you think that's significant?
Yes, I do. Matter of fact, I think that the 1913 amendment it's typical of what Congress does to us. They start out small, and then they get very, very big. Matter of fact, I think the withholding tax was only to be a temporary tax, the so-called victory tax during World War II. And I think that surely the tax code, making the tax code a part of the Constitution, was a very, very significant change. It was a revolution that confiscates private property. It makes us serfs in our own country.
That is right, and it seems like one feeds on itself. Government was not huge in 1913 and 1914, but once we as a people endorsed this concept that government could take this revenue, it seems like the politicians had no problems in figuring out what type of largesse they could pass out, and it looked like the people were rather receptive. So is the basic problem a problem with the politicians, or is the basic problem with the American people who are saying, you know, we want more things?
It's a problem with the American people. That is, first of all, the IRS is doing what Congress wants the IRS to do. Congressmen are doing what voters send them to Washington to do. That is, congressmen and senators are voted into office because they promise their constituents that they will use the power of their office to confiscate the property of one American and bring it back to them, either in terms of aid to higher education, highway funds, catastrophic health care, and all kinds of programs. So it's a congressman running on a platform of not doing that. That is, if he said to his constituents, I'm not going to use my office to bring you back money, somebody else's money, he would not get elected to office. So it's we the people who are to blame. That is, each of us think that our particular program is very, very important, but everybody thinks that their particular program is important. And if Congress does what we all want it to do, we're going to wind up with something that nobody wants. And the people on the show showed that the thing that we're winding up that nobody wants is an oppressive IRS.
On occasion, I've taken the position, quite frankly, I don't believe we need the income tax, and we don't need the Internal Revenue Service. But as an economist, what's your reaction? Do you think that we would get into economic problems if the government wasn't there to do certain things to benefit the economy, or could we make it without that tax?
Oh my goodness! I think I don't have to really give an answer to that question. That is, we have existed as a nation from 1776 up until 1913 without an income tax. And we became the most powerful and richest nation on the face of the earth during that period. So obviously it was not necessary. Many things that government's doing now are not necessarily. You know, if you look at the problems of the homeless, well, we've been a nation from 1776, 174 years up until we had HUD was put into office, and there weren't homeless people. Now all of a sudden, as a result of HUD, now we have homeless people. If you look at area after area where government has intruded, the problem has become worse rather than better.
Well, the liberal would come back and say, you're unconcerned, you don't care about the poor people, you don't want to help the people with houses, and you don't think we should tax people and put money into HUD?
Well, if I were a poor person today concerned with housing, I would pray to God that HUD would be abolished. That is
totally and completely.
Totally and completely. That is, HUD has in fact destroyed far more housing than it has created. But getting back to the issue of the program is that we have big government, and in order to finance big government, you're going to have oppressive taxes. And what Americans have to ask from their government is to have less government. Let me be free to keep my own paycheck. Let the people find their own solutions to their own problems.
Well, don't you think the deficit contributes to this? I mean, if we were balancing our budget, there might be less incentive for the IRS agent to be so ruthless. So as the deficit skyrocket, do you think this puts more emphasis on the IRS agent to collect more?
I think it's just spending, not deficits. That is, in any kind of meaningful economic sense, the budget is always balanced every single year. Yeah. That is, we collect so much in taxes, then we inflate as a way of Congress getting us to spend less, and then we enter the bond markets, drive up interest rates as a way to get us to spend less. So the issue should not, deficit is, I believe, is a rather phony issue. The issue is spending. That is, if the government spends $2 trillion as it does today, of necessity, it has to find a way to get us to spend $1.2 trillion less.
Dr. Williams, let's hold that thought for just a moment. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
Okay, we're back. Ron, before the break and earlier in the program, we saw a mention of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Let's talk about that.
You know, I think this is interesting. Originally, we had a Bill of Rights. The 10 amendments to the Constitution was supposed to be a Bill of Rights to protect our rights. And here, not too many years ago, I was a co-sponsor of a bill which I felt uncomfortable with, the fact that we had to have a taxpayer's Bill of Rights. It's almost like the taxpayer isn't a citizen. I was a supporter of that amendment and the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, but to me it was rather sad. Yes. And I was delighted with the publicity, with getting the Taxpayers Bill of Rights passed, but it still made me a little bit uneasy. And for instance, there was one part in one of the versions of the bill which was removed at conference, which was the key to the whole bill that I had supported, and that was the burden of proof. Don't you think this might have been the real issue?
I think so. Matter of fact, I believe it was one congressman who was a supporter of the Bill of Rights. He says, we just want the IRS to treat the average American taxpayer like a criminal. That is, give him the same rights that a criminal has. That is, give him Miranda warnings, that whatever he says is going to be held against him in the court of law, and require evidence and put the burden of proof on the state. That is many American taxpayers, when they come before the IRS, they're not treated as well as murderers, robbers, and thugs, and all those evil people in our society. And I think that if we have something in there, as the congressman said, to get the IRS to treat us at least as well as criminals are treated, I think that will be a great step in the right direction.
You know, the other thing that has concerned me about the IRS is the confiscation of property. They don't prove that you owe the money. They can literally come in and confiscate your account and your car and your house and your boat, and then you go into court to try to get it back. And that seems to be a bit contradictory to the intentions of the founders in this country.
Well, it's contrary to the intentions of the founders, but I think we have to keep one thing in mind. That is, we cannot put the burden at the foot of the IRS. That is, those people who are working there, for the most part, they're people like you and I who are worrying about our mortgages, sending kids to school. They're American citizens. But they are following orders, just like the Gestapo was following orders. They're following orders. And who are they following orders from? It's the Congress and the Senate.
Of course, what I'd like to see is a few more American people wake up and send some more orders to the American Congress and change some of this. You know, there's an interesting thing also. They change the notification period of time from 10 days to 30 days before they can take money out of your account. But it's interesting how that backfired. Now the banks, if they happen to allow the people to spend or readjust their accounts during that 30 days, the bank becomes liable.
Oh, that is awful. And what that in effect does, it's the IRS taking the bank as part of its agency. It's using the bank as its collection agency, as it uses employers and everybody else.
And they just happen to have a license that would be jeopardized if they don't follow the rules.
Yes,
so in a way, we've reduced the time to 0 days rather than extending it to 30.
And I would like to see the question asked, well, look, if I owe the Bank of America or some private bank or a private entrepreneur that kind of money, he does not have rights to walk into my account. Why should anybody else have rights? What's the difference? In my opinion, that is, individual rights and property rights should be upheld by the courts, and you should not have any property taken from you until you've had your day in court.
You know, and there are restrictions against collecting agencies. You know, you're not allowed to call at night, and you're not allowed to do what they call harassing to collect private debts. It'd be interesting to apply some of those same rules to the IRS.
Or if a private debt collector did what we saw in the film, where they smashed into that lady's car, he would be put in jail.
Yes.
He would be put in jail.
There's no doubt. I think things are turned upside down. The government now is the instrument of ruthless tactics, and the people are the victims. And it was supposed to be the other way around. The government was supposed to be protecting the citizens from becoming victims.
But this was anticipated by Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson said that the general tendency of things is for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield. And that's what we're saying.
Our time's getting short, and we need to wind this up. So let me ask each of you to comment on the short run for a moment. Walt, what's the next step? What's the first thing we ought to do to improve life for us as taxpayers?
Well, it's not a short step. We need to demand more moral government. That is, we need to demand that government get out of the business of confiscating the property of one American and giving it to another American to whom it does not belong. And we would find that we need a less abusive tax system.
And Ron, your view?
Well, I think the first thing we ought to do is remove that slogan from the IRS building that says that taxes is what we pay for a civilized society. Sometimes I think it's exactly the opposite. I think we have to wake the American people up and let them know that taxes is what is confiscated from one group of people to be used by another group, and it's a form of theft. And as soon as the American people realize that, I think we'll get back to a sensible approach to government.
Well, that's where we'll have to leave it. On behalf of Ron Paul, I want to thank Walter Williams for being with us, and I want to thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with another vital topic at issue.